Hello, this is Josh, and this video is a continuation of a series in which I will properly define my design philosophy and my ambitions to make the best game. My hope in doing this is to instill change in the gaming industry that will produce a market for a more nuanced kind of player, suitable to appreciate that kind of game. This is because I would assert that the market as it exists now does not cater to a profound acquired sense of taste found in veteran players, whom I call hardcores and define simply as those who care about the quality of game that is handed to them to the extent that it actually influences which games they indulge and purchase, and instead is marketed towards casuals, which are defined simply as their negation. But also, if it's not overtly clear, especially if you've watched my first video, I take myself way too seriously. Anyway, if any of these premises are in dispute for you and you find the quality of games to be adequate or more than adequate, then by all means disregard this video. So firstly, to recap a bit, the problem with modern games is the lack of pre-production. Devs are simply not given the ample time by either publishers or producers to effectively articulate or implement their ideas into their fullest. The primary reason for this is budgets. The competitive nature of the gaming industry forces companies to adhere to restrictive policies that capitalize on the fact that a game can just as easily be produced without substantial originality due to the fact that highly lucrative templates in game design exist, effectively cutting out the needs of devs as artists and increasing the value of devs as simply workers. Templates being some kind of pattern that can be transitioned easily from a setting to another. In gaming, this is traditionally models like FPS, RTS, racing, platformer, hack and slash, beat 'em up, shoot 'em up, bullet hell, and of course, the RPG, and many more. These ideas come in packages that both house good and bad traits. While they are useful for envisioning prototypes, the ideas also encourage bad practices, even if they are also recognized as precedents of the genre. They encourage practices of borrowing other content as inspiration, but sometimes they also take design ideas without understanding exactly how they complemented the game they belong to, or just simply steal it. This can continue endlessly and has the potential to stagnate as the concept eventually becomes conventional but can be applied erroneously over and over again if the game that originally borrowed the idea did so poorly, and then the games that borrow from the borrower may or may not apply them correctly. This process is also an engine of destruction for originality. A concept upon its conception may or may not have been fully realized as it's implemented into the final product, and then never really gets there because the idea has been so commercialized that it has become boring. Designers do make mistakes too, but once production begins, changing the ideas becomes impossible. Contracts have been signed, deadlines have been made, it's too late. Extended pre-production can solve this if the designers analyze extensively the properties of design traits. Now that sounds complicated, but it's really not all that difficult. For instance, to understand that making an animation that has lots of iframes and no recovery frames or execution requirements will make that game inherently favor defensive play. But it is easier still to simply copy that animation and have it inserted into another game. What makes things difficult is the mass of design traits that need consideration as a whole, and getting them all to complement each other in perfect synergy is what is difficult. But ironically, the people who do this the most and are the biggest culprits of lazily copying design traits are in fact the original creators, even though this is not technically theft. Because as soon as a game is successful, it is easy to get into the mindset that things are good enough the way they are. Continuing to be original at this point is more of a chore than anything else. I can say this because, as any self-respecting artist knows, there's no such thing as good enough. And yes, I know that is easy to say if millions of dollars aren't on the line, but that's really only further evidence that the industry has money as its top priority, and that competition has ruined its artistic virtue. But it's not just an industry. It may be right now, but it doesn't have to be. Now that's all fairly straightforward and intuitive, I hope, but what is not abundantly clear is why we, that is to say, a majority of gamers beyond a group of arrogant hardcores, should care about the quality of games. The most universal answer to that is escapism and how it affects gamers. But that's not actually what this video is about because the subject is rather touchy and will require its own video. Instead of what I will be talking about today is how pre-production is difficult and hence expensive, but also where it can fall short, and how to improve it, and how that can essentially solve most of the problems to the best of my abilities. To begin, a game outside of platform, which should be self-explanatory, and mechanics like a control scheme, are the three different virtual components: visual, audio, and writing. One of these things is more important than the others, however, in that the others are dependent on the third, which is writing. The plot, characters, and setting determine what kind of music, art, animation, sound effects, etc. are employed in the media. But what is also true is that while you can continuously improve the quality of animation and backgrounds as components of art, for example, and better ambience or more complete orchestral scores that can transcribe larger arrays of emotion as components of music and sound, the quality of these two major aspects, I would assert, cap and flatline earlier than writing. That is to say that unlike writing, the others, upon reaching great quality, can't really be improved upon noticeably. In addition, a director, including art and music directors, in turn need a solid script to utilize their audio and visuals propensity and implement them in the most punctual manner. This means that in a healthy pre-productions environment, they are of less concern in the long run when compared to writing. The reason that writing does not cap is simply because a given subject matter can always be given more details. You can always develop characters more. You can always add more characters. A setting can always be developed more, with more locations, with more history, and you can always add more plot. This brings us to the first principle of design. Quantity is quality. Now here's the logic behind this ironically counterintuitive expression. The fact of the matter is that any given idea or design can be criticized harshly. No matter what we do as artists, someone will always make the case that it isn't good work. Art and design is subjective, no matter how much we disagree with an opposing opinion, and believe me, everyone will disagree with almost everything. Even if someone thinks Michelangelo is crap and I disagree and think they're stupid, and believe me, I would, I cannot objectively say they are incorrect. Now you can impose a standard or style by which to measure the quality of art, like naturalism or impressionism, for instance, but this quickly becomes a battle of semantics, and at the end of the day, anyone can still argue your definitions of art are bad. However, what you can always definitively argue to be of greater quality than Michelangelo is Michelangelo plus practically anything else, even a piece of crap. Content A versus content A plus content B can never be of less quality than content A, even if content B is crap. And no, Michelangelo with crap smeared over it is not still Michelangelo. It is Michelangelo with crap smeared over it. Now, while the analogy is silly, the logic is useful. Someone will always find some part of your design to be erroneous, but you can always still say that the game as a whole is still better than if the content was removed entirely, with emphasis on removed, not redone, because content A would no longer be content A if it were redone. Redone is subjective. Therefore, due to the fact that quality is ironically not sufficient to measure quality, quantity is by default the only reliable tool to measure quality. The only caveat to this is that repetitious content is not equivalent to more content. It is recycled content. Content A is still content A. You have not added anything to it, you're just using it again. Where there is room for healthy debate is if content A is better than content B. Is 100 square miles of great quality better than 200 square miles of great quality? Which is better, it will tend to favor quantity over quality if there is enough quantity to it. When the quantities of content X and Y are not equal, an argument will ensue over which is preferable based on the overall level of quality. Here is a definitive way of showing yourself which is better. If the quality of either content doesn't stand out to you as overwhelmingly better than the other such that you would prefer any amount of content Y over any amount of content X, then the two can be considered equal level of quality, and the case can be made, at least for yourself, that if you increase the initial amount of content Y, with something like DLC for instance, and still are of the same opinion, then content X is definitively of better quality than content Y. This is because you have just increased the overall level of quality of Y via quantity, and yet you still see both content X and content Y as overall equals. Therefore, your own original assessment is wrong by your own standards. You would, as it turns out, prefer some level of content Y to be comparable to content X than just Y by itself. The overall quality of the two contents can't still be equal if you just increased one of them. Now, how does this fact mix with the earlier statement about giving ample time to devs under the philosophy of quantity is quality? How much time is enough when good enough is non-existent? The answer is that the scope of the design must be decided under the responsibility of the lead designer. There must be an effective communication between all designers to determine what the design is meant to accomplish, or its scope. Typically, the scope is made with technical reasons in mind, like utilizing a particular engine that has only recently been commercialized, but as far as artistically, This means that a cutoff point must be established to preserve the integrity of the concepts. This is necessary because of the natural depreciation of theming, which describes the idea that an art piece must be predicated upon an idea that is central to its theme. This can be supplemented with other themes as outliers, but essentially the concepts you fill a piece with become less important when others are added because of the limit of attention span of an audience. If you write a story about poverty start to finish, that is the core of the story, and the piece has greater potential to metaphorically represent that concept better. However, if you rewrite the story so that it is now about poverty and racism, but with the same length or quantity, the reader must now understand both of these themes within the same amount of time. The story then becomes less about poverty and more about racism. This continues endlessly as you add more themes and don't increase the length of the story proportionately. And so, because a piece of media can never be infinitely long and thus need an infinite budget, and even if they did, the audience would never have an infinite attention span, a scope must be employed that can effectively determine when the concepts have been aptly represented. This is what I call the second principle of design. Quantity must be balanced with theming. The scope is something that must be developed jointly among the designers and must be able to be changed at a moment's notice as debate of design traits and techniques ensues. But as I described earlier, this is not feasible once production has begun, which is why pre-production is all the more important. It's not just useful to make good content, it is indispensable. Now, as far as changing the industry, these two principles by themselves are not all that useful. What we are really interested in is the point that when the statements are laid out inversely, they have great implications. The inverse of quantity is quality, is lack of quantity is lack of quality. The inverse of quantity must be balanced with theming, is theming must be balanced with quantity. Now bear with me as I explain why that's important in just a moment. But first, back to the virtual elements of games, with writing being the most important for the aforementioned reasons. With this bearing in mind, you can effectively categorize all games into 3 different types based on their kind of conflict and ratio of writing to audio-visual they implement. These are objective, competitive, and simulation. These archetypes, as you'll notice upon careful examination, all have one thing in common: the fact that they are all distinguished by the type of conflict they ask the player to solve, which is the entire purpose of a game. Games are problems that need to be solved by players. Objective being anything that is seemingly arbitrary, like solving a puzzle, reaching a finish line, or obtaining collectibles. These types of conflict require the least amount of writing and are therefore heavy in the use of audio-visual to sell their conflict. Competitive or cooperation is also very straightforward in that an objective may still remain arbitrary, but the real strength of the conflict comes from the fact that one or more person is participating in it. This can be at odds with the player, such as in competitive genres, or cooperation like multiplayer. The point to be made here is that the writing, for the most part, must be developed at least to the point where the players are antagonized against each other or a common foe, and hence will bear on average a greater investment into writing than objective-type conflict, and the audio-visual elements are less of a role to the point where they may even only supplement the writing. Finally, we have simulation category. Simulation serves to emulate environments to propagate problems for players to solve. However, in order for problems to affect and/or entice the player and therefore involve them in their environment and the solutions to its problems, the problems themselves must seem natural to their environment. The player must feel as though the environment itself is the root of the problem. The failure to do this will result in reversion back to arbitrary motivation like an objective-type conflict. And so this distinction, you could say, is maintained entirely by writing. This is commonly and appropriately called immersion. Simulations, then, for the most part, require the most writing to develop a setting for the design in order for the environment to be rich enough with problems so that the audio-visual elements can grow to suit it more perfectly. This brings me to one of my main points for this video, which is the importance of setting. But before I can get to that, I must also say that these categories can and often overlap and exhibit properties of either archetypes. However, one is always more relevant than another, and when making this distinction you have to ask, what is the source of the problem? What is the source of the conflict as it relates to the player? Often the easiest ways to make this distinction is to ask if the problem would still exist if you remove the properties of one of the archetypes from the conflict. Is the game still playable? For instance, if you're playing an MMO and your party leaves, can you still play the game? Yes. The environment is still propagating problems for you to solve. But if you remove objectives in the environment for the players to complete together, the game is over. Another example, if you're playing a fighting game with warriors on a battlefield and change them to spacecraft in an asteroid field, the problem has not changed. The environment is not producing the majority of the problems. Your opponent is. and if you remove them, the game's over, and therefore it is a competitive type game. Even in the rare instance when things seem to be perfectly balanced, you're still not playing a hybrid of any kind, you're simply solving two problems at once, and in that instance the game type is whatever problem has the highest priority, even if in that instance the game has changed types overall. The fact is that games within games exist all the time. By understanding these differences, you can more appropriately define a given game and therefore understand how to analyze and judge its traits and how they complement the game they are in, as I mentioned before. Certain traits will be more important to a given type of conflict. Understanding what type of game you are making or playing will help you determine and analyze which aspects of design need to be prioritized first and thus incorporated into design docs and prototypes. Again, as mentioned before, the problem is not that doing this is difficult necessarily, it's that you have a lot of traits to design and hence priorities will be natural. But on to the problem. Because simulation-type games require the most writing and have the highest peaks of creativity, and because audio-visual elements are dependent on that writing, particularly setting, simulation is therefore the highest tier of game design that can be made, and because, like an artist of realism whose main objective is to achieve three-dimensionality, the main purpose of a simulation, and therefore the best games, is to achieve immersion as its highest priority. The point I wish to make is that games break this immersion in their writing all the time. The quality of writing is at many times atrocious and quickly becomes more abhorrent when you become more aware of just how much time and money is put into these projects. And that is really the salient point among the many key facets you'll find on this topic. The money. It's perpetually reoccurring. To quickly reiterate, I'm not trying to say that the entire gaming industry is guilty of this, as many games don't even attempt writing because it's not as much of a concern to that game's conflicts such as competitive and arbitrary types, especially since those can be featured in the larger scope of a simulation game in the first place. It's simply a rare phenomenon to see simulations with mechanics as refined as competitive games, which isn't a bad design, it's simply difficult to develop. But I think we can all agree that a game with an immersive environment and excellent mechanics suitable for competitive play would be a treat. No, I'm actually referring to games that have budgets that go into the hundreds of millions. The games that are supposed to be representative of the peak of gaming and game design, and that are made to appeal to the widest demographic and most diverse set of platform outside of mobile games, which are mostly mindless and built purely for hedonistic value anyway. But back to the point, that despite the budget and dedicated venue, the writing for most of these AAA games is subpar and at far too many times downright insulting. Now how do I know this? Firstly, as I mentioned above, originality quickly becomes less of a virtue for these titles upon initial success. Secondly, because the video game industry isn't the first to employ these tactics of glossing over details of a scenario so that a plot can continue. You can watch any modern movie or TV show and find plot holes in them to see this executed. Thirdly, empirical data. It's not really necessary or possible for me to critique everybody's favorite game and then point out its flaws. You can look to any self-proclaimed gaming analyst here on YouTube to hear them say essentially the same thing with the embellishment of first-hand experience if you fucking need it. Mostly, all I have to do is appeal to my and your own anecdotal evidence. Anytime you've thought to yourself any of the following things, for instance, while playing a game. That doesn't make sense. Where the hell is my blank when I needed it? Where the hell was blank when I needed them? I thought my blank was supposed to be the insert label for special blank. Why am I losing to these random blanks? That was a shitty ending. That was pointless. Bullshit. Where does blank go when I put it away? How is my/the blank doing blank at all times? Where the hell have they been this whole time? What the hell have they been doing this whole time? Why didn't they just do that earlier? That was too easy. That wasn't worth it. Here we go again with this. Wow, haven't done this blank number of times already. I can't believe I paid blank for this blanking blank. And the list goes on. These are loose examples, of course, but to cite at least one specific example, we will look at the DC Marvel universes, which have many continuities as not to single out a specific group and because they obey many of the same precedents in the genre. A systemic flaw that is prevalent to almost every storyline is the mortality of given character or characters. I'm referring specifically to how it is inconsistent, especially during crossovers. In short, inconsistencies break immersion because the gravity of a given conflict is supposed to remain static in its own context so that the relevance of it will remain intact or strengthened throughout the story. If a character knowingly displays fortitude that grants immunity to peril that was previously counted as life-threatening, you have literally lied to the audience. This is not a case of unreliable narrator. This is blatant misinformation that is usually written earlier in the plot when the conflict of the setting wasn't as tumultuous as the conflict written later down the plot, which trivializes an early story and permanently damages consistency when the character itself has not changed. For any well-written story, making sure plot remains intact throughout the story is trivial and simply requires that you know your story start to finish before you fucking publish it. And yet, during many engagements, when characters receive injuries, some of which would gravely injure, if not instantly kill, a normal person, the main character is granted resistance to an otherwise fatal injury without explanation, even if in their particular context their superpower does nothing to improve the fortitude of the character and increase their chance of survival. It is very much the case that the audience grants the protagonist and antagonist alike extra suspension of disbelief simply because they have a costume on and are relevant to the plot. Even when characters do die, it is sometimes still due to something that they haven't had trouble surviving in the past. An overwhelmingly abundant case is the miraculous hardiness of a given character to survive explosions when their proximity to it is unforgivably close. I encourage anyone to look up something like Blast Along and see if they can view their favorite storyline with the same legitimacy. The explanation for this in games, however, is not that because the developers lack the ability to notice these things. It is because often, in most cases, that it is a production oversight to make a story more dramatic. In writing, this is what is commonly referred to as Deus Ex Machina bullshit, or bullshit for short. It's a Latin phrase which I'm sure many of you well know that is essentially used to describe the transparency of a plot device and is typically distinguished by how overtly the audience is expected to suspend their disbelief in an inappropriately or insufficiently substantiated plot change, mostly, if not strictly, due to its convenience and can permanently damage consistency. Like a character being in debt 20 grand, finding out that the bowling tournament in his state has a grand prize with a 20k pot. Similarly, a superhero in a dire situation that survives only because he or she punched a machine which opens a secret way out, or landing in water deep in a ravine instead of dying like everyone else would. But this also applies to marginal convenience such as missed vital spots or having just enough power to do etc. while it still matters. When these things happen, they trivialize the plot. Just like in real life, the grounds for a story to be believable is only as strong as its least believable foundation. This is the second principle of design, and it must be observed. When a character's success or failure is determined in part by technicalities, then the legitimacy of the character's success or failures can only be attributed to those technicalities because the ending would be reversed without them. In other words, never substitute plot with luck. Never write yourself into a corner that can only be escaped with more bad writing. Now, why is failure to do this so bad, you might ask? This is the problem, and perhaps the most important thing to grasp after watching this video if you don't already see it. When a writer consciously decides to skip steps in development, when they sacrifice realism, sacrifice consistency, sacrifice immersion for melodramatic expediency, they are saying to the audience that you are too stupid to notice. You are not worth the effort to maintain the integrity of the storyline. They are saying that despite your relentless loyalty, you don't care about the quality of your own hobbies. They are saying that you will take whatever they give you, and you'll never know the difference, like a good little bitch. This is why games that employ writing and most creative media that is marketed towards fans of the genre don't stand on their merits. This is why it doesn't stand up to criticism and can therefore never be seen as a reputable part of someone's culture. Because in any other commendable creative forms of expression, this would be artistic suicide. When the credibility of an art form hinges on how much error the venue is willing to forgive, or quality they are willing to impose as a cyclical fact, that art is not substantiated by quality, but rather it is sustained by bias and favoritism. But again, I stress, pre-production can erase this problem. All it takes is a well-written story that is thought out beforehand completely, where consistency is of the highest priority, and there are no plot holes, and all powers that can ever come into play are at play as earliest and inconveniently as possible, and eliminate Deus Ex Machina bullshit. This is difficult to ask, I know, especially when it's a long story like my own, because whenever you pitch an idea, it can always still get a no, but it's part of being an artist. This is why almost every story fails somewhere in its consistency, because no one has time to invest into a possible failure, but it is also why such stories don't exist anywhere in the industry, and why I believe I have the best chance at changing it, because win or lose, I've already put 15 years into it. I have nothing else to lose. It is only a matter of time, and I'll show you how I'll do it every step of the way.